The IMF released its regional economic outlook for Sub-Saharan Africa in mid-October. It concluded that economic growth for the region would be 3.6% in 2022. That compares with 4.7% in 2021. For South Africa, it pegged growth at 2.1% for this year and rising at a much slower pace of 1.1% next year. Well, to discuss some of the issues tied to the numbers, I'm joined in studio by Catherine Patillo. She's the Deputy Director of the IMF Africa Department. Thank you very much, Catherine, for joining us.
Thank you.
So, of course, one of the topical issues right now globally is the higher inflation situation and the higher monetary or the higher interest rate situation where monetary policy regulators are deciding to push up interest rates in order to deal with inflation, but then, in turn, it has unintended consequences for economic growth. How do you see all of this playing out in the Sub-Saharan African region?
Thanks. So overall, we're seeing a very, very difficult time for the region right now. And there are three main global shocks. So first, there is the slowing of global economic activity, which then translates into a lower demand for exports from the region. And second, as you mentioned, we're seeing this global financial tightening, which means with the very high inflation in many countries, central banks are tightening monetary policy. That translates then into sharp increases in borrowing costs for the region, drying up of access to international capital markets, and really a squeeze then on the fiscal, the ability to spend on important developmental needs. And the third big global shock is the spillovers from the war in Ukraine, which of course have dramatically increased food, fuel, fertilizer prices, and that's contributing to a big increase in food inflation in the region and overall inflation.
Yes.
Right now, over 40% of countries in the region have double-digit inflation. And that food inflation then is, of course, exacerbating the really awful food insecurity situation in many countries.
Yes.
So all this feeds in, as you say, to the growth hit. You mentioned the numbers, and importantly, the hit to people who spend a large part of their consumption on food. So really concerned about the vulnerable, the urban poor. And in light of that, then, our report outlines a number of policy priorities. One, of course, addressing food insecurity. Governments need to do what they can to make sure to save lives. And second, combating inflation and doing that in a gradual, cautious way, but making sure that inflation doesn't get out of control.
Yeah. Now, of course, as authorities seek to ensure that inflation doesn't get out of control, their action to raise interest rates is likely to put pressure on economies, and there are fears that the US economy, for example, could go into a recession. And of course, we've heard that expression that when that particular economy coughs, everybody else catches a cold. So, when it comes to demand for commodities, I mean, South Africa, for example, is a key commodity exporter, and other African countries rely on commodity revenues. There is an anticipation that there's going to be a slowdown for commodities. Now, if that does happen and revenues begin to slow for African countries who normally depend on those revenues, what can they do in the interim to mitigate that potential? And obviously, because obviously it means that they're going to get less revenue from commodities.
Yes. So in our baseline, we're expecting the international prices of most commodities, that's food as well as metals, beverages, fuel, etc., to decline in next year. And that's largely because of also this weakening global economic activity. Remember, 1/3 of the world economy is likely to contract this year or next year. So that really dries up that demand for commodities. It doesn't immediately translate for commodities like food into a decrease in domestic prices. There are lags, and if there are currency depreciations, then that can offset. So that's the baseline, but the baseline is subject to huge uncertainty right now, lots of risks. If there were greater sanctions on Russia, then you could see some commodity prices, fuel prices going back up. So lots and lots of uncertainty. Now, what countries can do? What they can do is, particularly in times of higher commodity prices, they can save some of those windfall revenues then and build up cash buffers so that they are more prepared for when commodity prices go down. We've done some analysis, particularly for oil exporters, that shows, given the volatility of oil prices and the likely shocks, countries would need to build these buffers of around, African countries, around 5 to 10%. It's much lower than in some of the other oil exporters, but building the buffers then is needed to deal with potential shocks. We're going to be living in a much more shock-prone world going forward.
Absolutely. So, of course, one of the issues that the IMF has been raising for the longest time since COVID is the worry about some countries, not only on the African continent, but other areas as well in the subcontinent in the south, that some countries will fall into debt distress. And I know that there's been a campaign, especially by the United Nations Secretary General, for developed countries to do more in terms of supporting those countries. What's going to happen, and where can those countries get support where they fall into debt distress?
Thanks. Yeah, so debt vulnerabilities have been rising, but there is not a systemic problem of debt everywhere in the region. So these debt indicators have been increasing and showing, risk and signs of stress. And then the developments right now in the international markets, again, the rising interest rates, increasing the cost of borrowing, the drying up of access to international capital markets, this is making it even more challenging for some of the frontier markets. So I think it's important to be clear, though, that there is no widespread debt crisis, that there are some countries who have reached the critical point and they have appropriately initiated discussions with their creditors. But you really need to look at the situation, country by country. And for many countries, then, they are really tackling their debt challenges very much head on. And there's a widespread recognition of the need for, increasing revenue, for prioritizing spending, for engaging with their development partners to make sure they can, meet urgent needs in a timely manner. So really, really challenging, things head on. And the IMF is very much supporting countries in those efforts. Right now, we have around 22 lending programs with countries, a number of other staff-monitored programs to help countries maintain stability, catalyze financing, tide them over in this difficult time. The IMF also, since the start of the pandemic, has dispersed around 50 billion, including lending and the SDR allocation. So we're very engaged. We're very present. I would mention finally that these issues right now should not keep us away from recognizing countries in the region need financing for development. And so the international community, the financial markets need to stay engaged, with countries on a country-by-country basis. And where debt is unsustainable, where there are those big debt distress risks, where it's unsustainable, then there are venues to address that, like the common framework. But what we don't want is then that this situation right now makes us not focus on the need for the recovery, which then will help with longer-term potential, and that we think we shouldn't mistake what are liquidity challenges for many countries, and think that means that there's unsustainable debt for all countries.
Yeah. Now, Catherine, we've got less than 2 minutes,
Okay.
but I must ask you this. Of course, a number of countries around the globe are going to COP27 in Egypt next month, November. And of course, you know, there's a dichotomy with the ability of the North, the developed North, to be able to invest in climate change and mitigation and adaptation, and of course, what the South can do. What do you think African nations need to expect from the COP27 meetings?
So there is going to be a lot of attention at this COP, I think, to the issues that are really important for the continent. There'll be a lot of attention to the need for support for adaptation, in addition to mitigation, because we're seeing the impacts of these climate shocks now, and we're going to see the increase in those going forward. And they have big impacts on people's lives, and they're, you know, impacting importantly food insecurity. So we're going to see an emphasis on adaptation, and we're going to see an emphasis on finance, on pushing for the finance, because African countries cannot do it alone. They have great potential in the green transition, but there's a need then for the international community to support in both adaptation finance and mitigation finance.
Indeed. Catherine, thank you very much for your time and coming to our studios here at the SABC. That was Catherine Patillo. She's the Deputy Director of the IMF Africa Department.